So I'm not sure if you guys are aware of this, but TF2 is pretty well known for its hats. Everyone and their mother has coined this game as a quote-unquote war-themed hat simulator. Actually, I haven't really heard anyone call it that in a while, but this game is known for many iconic reasons, and hats are one of those main reasons. Heck, we're still receiving new hats and cosmetics to this day since they've become a staple of this game's longevity. As you might guess though, with a game that's had hats for nearly 15 years now, some of those hats are at best more memorable than others, and at worst, nearly forgettable in most regards. And today, let's talk about those forgotten hats. I want to look at each class's hat selection and finally answer the question of which hats are the most forgettable. Of course, this is just my opinion, and some of you might still use these hats to this day, which is great. But to me personally, these hats I've shown you are just the ones that I find most forgettable. I do have two things to note first though. When I say a hat's forgettable, I don't necessarily mean that it's a bad hat. I'm just referring to the fact that I either don't see it worn very often, or that it's not sitting in the front recesses of my mind when I boot up the game. And sure, I might believe that some of these hats are bad, but that's not always going to be the case. Secondly, I'm specifically choosing hats, not full body cosmetics or accessories. Anything that equips the top head/face region is fair game. This is because I might make a second video just like this one, but instead focusing on which cosmetics are the most forgotten. So with all of that out of the way, let's take a look at which hats in Team Fortress 2 have been forgotten the most. Starting with Scout's most forgotten hats, it's a three-way tie between the Mountebank's mask, the flipped trilby, and the pomade prince. Honestly, while I'm not the biggest fan of the Mountebank's mask and much prefer the other two hats mentioned, it's kinda sad that these hats aren't seen too often anymore. The flipped trilby and the pomade prince are such basic hats, but there's so much going on with their simplicity. The trilby is a nice hat that would complement many loadouts with its subtle charm, and the pomade prince gives Scout's default hair a nice little makeover. Again, even though I don't really like the Mountebank's mask too much, I still think it's an interesting cosmetic that was made and textured well by its community contributors. I think the reason that these hats aren't seen too much these days is basically because other more popular hats that look just like these exist. The flipped trilby is a nice hat, but because it's so simple, other hats seem more interesting by comparison and therefore are going to be used more often. In the case of the pomade prince, the Baseball Bills Sports Shine exists, which was one of the Scout's first hats, making it quite memorable, and two, looks almost the exact same as the pomade prince. Apart from this little tuft of hair, there's not a distinguishable difference between these hats. At a passing glance, they look so similar that some players may assume a Scout is just wearing the Sports Shine, while forgetting the pomade prince's very existence. In regards to the Mountebank's mask, it's such a specific looking hat that it will only really fit a jester style loadout, which many players may not want to use. At least these hats are still worn by a few players, meaning they're not truly forgotten, but unfortunately these hats just aren't as popular as you might think. Moving on to Soldier's most forgotten hats, we have the Lucky Shot and the Doughboy. I actually really like the Lucky Shot since it's such a silly idea for a hat, but to me it somehow fits Soldier's personality and reminds me of that old school humor that TF2 had, goofy but not over the top. But unfortunately, like some of Scout's hats that we previously mentioned, it's too similar to other hats to be memorable. In this case, the Lucky Shot is the Soldier's default helmet with a missile sticking out. Apart from that tiny explosive, it's the exact same hat. Because of this, I think some people don't even think it's worth wearing since some people might not immediately notice the difference in appearance between the two hats. The only time I ever see someone wearing the Lucky Shot is if it's an unusual quality, but at least in that case, some players are still willing to wear this hat, making its rare appearances noteworthy. The same thing can't be said about the Doughboy, however. I didn't really want to put promotional items on this list because they're not really used as often as default hats and cosmetics anymore. But I am willing to make the exception for Soldier because in my nearly 10 years of playing TF2, I've never seen someone wearing this hat in game. I tend to see other promotional hats here and there, but not this one. Heck, the only reason I remembered that it even is in the game is when I randomly crafted one last month. And unlike the Lucky Shot, the Doughboy can't be obtained in unusual quality, making it even less likely that someone would wear it. I honestly like the design of this hat though, making it all the more upsetting that no one wears it anymore. I'm still keeping an eye out for it in a public match because I know that one day maybe I'll see someone wearing it. Choosing Pyro's most forgotten hats is super easy. That title goes to the Little Buddy and the Pyromancer's hood. The problem with the Little Buddy is that it doesn't really fit the Pyro's character nearly as much as the rest of their hats. I mean, Pyro's this mysterious figure covered head to toe in a suit that protects them from the very flames that befall their enemies. With a character as menacing as that, a sailor hat doesn't really seem to fit the Pyro's description all too well. The Pyro's associated with fire, and sailors are associated with the open sea. So because these characteristics are such polar opposites, I feel like not that many people would even want to wear a hat like that. And because of that, people forget this hat exists because no one's wearing it. It's one of those hats that you don't really see unless it's in unusual quality, but on the other hand, the Pyromancer's hood can better fit into more pyro loadouts since such a simple hood is just that, simple and able to fit into your desired look for a class easier. But it's a limited edition hat that released back in 2014, and because of that can't be obtained anymore aside from purchasing outright. If you go to the Steam community market, you'll see that it is indeed a limited item. At the time of recording this, there are only 14 unique ones priced at $7.01, and 11 strange ones priced at $14. It being on the pricier side limits its accessibility to many players, and that coupled with its limited release in an update nearly 10 years ago, makes it one of Pyro's most forgotten hats. It is one of my most favorite Pyro cosmetics though, as it's one of the first ones I ever owned, and I think it just looks good overall. But as it stands, this, along with the little buddy, will probably remain as Pyro's lesser seen hats. Okay, so for Demoman's most forgotten hats, we've got the Stylish DeGroot and the Bomber's Bucket Hat. Like some of the other hats previously mentioned, the Stylish DeGroot has better and more popular alternatives used by the player base. I will use this video to give the Stylish DeGroot a shout out though because wow, that's a clean cut. And the headband the demo uses is also super stylish. But again, since other hats that have a similar theme have been released after the Stylish DeGroot did, those hats will be seen far more frequently than this one. The Bomber's Bucket Hat is also in the same boat since, let's be real here for a second, for as long as the Decorated Veteran exists, it'll just be known as the superior version of the Bucket Hat since the Decorated Veteran is A, all class, and B, has alternative styles to better fit your loadouts. I have fond memories of the Bomber's Bucket Hat since it was released in End of the Line, one of the first TF2 updates I played after just starting the game for the first time. I happened to unbox it one day and thought it was a nice simple hat for demo. But again, the other alternatives for Demo's headgear makes the Bomber's Bucket Hat as well as the Stylish DeGroot almost obsolete to many players who use better alternatives. Heavy's most forgotten hats is an interesting case since as the community probably recognizes, he's one of the least played classes, making the chances of you even seeing someone's heavy cosmetics lower by default. Even with the fewer opportunities to see what most players wear as a heavy, choosing his most forgotten hats is still easy. That title goes to the Minnesota Slick and the Outdoorsman. Now I don't have a good reason as to why the Minnesota Slick is seen so infrequently in players' loadouts, but I do have one idea. As you can see, the Minnesota Slick is a hair/cigarette combo, but the problem with that is that some players might not want to have a cigarette in their loadout as it might ruin their heavy's cosmetic theming. And unfortunately, there's not a no cigarette style to this hair hat, meaning that players who like the hair will just have to end up having a cigarette in their loadout even if it doesn't fit that same loadout. In the case of the Outdoorsman, I think the recent addition of better looking cosmetics that outshine it in terms of popularity is the simple answer to why this hat isn't used too often anymore. That's honestly a shame since I like the idea of the Outdoorsman as a hat, but even I can't deny that newer hats fit the whole lumberjack look for heavy much better. For Engineer, we've got two hats that qualify for his most forgotten ones, the Trencher's Topper and the Partner's Pompadour. In the case of the Trencher's Topper, I think the reason that you never really see it anymore is the chin strap. Speaking personally here for a second, I don't really like the strap too much and I think the hat would look better overall if it came with a style that unclipped the strap or got rid of it entirely. I'm not really sure that this would be the proper protocol when actually going into trenches, but regardless, it would look better without it. The biggest issue with this strap, however, is that it clips with all of the beard cosmetics, and if you've played Engineer for even 10 minutes, you'll know that he looks really cool with a beard. So if you use the Trencher's Topper, you'll either have to opt for a weird clipping issue with your beard or wear no beard at all. On the other hand, the Partner's Pompadour is a solid hair cosmetic for Engie, and I like the overall design of it a ton. But like most of the cosmetics I've already talked about, there's better, more popular alternatives, so it isn't really seen as much anymore. I do want to mention the addition of the glasses with this cosmetic, as while I honestly think they're pretty stylish, I'd imagine not every player does too, and like with the lack of alternative styles with the Trencher's Topper, there's not an alternative style for the Pompadour either, so you can't remove the glasses or even paint them a different color. So unfortunately, while these cosmetics are pretty solid overall, they both lack different styles that some players would prefer over the default options, and because they're not used that much anymore, they're Engineer's most forgotten hats. For Medic, the only hat I can really think of that would be considered his most forgotten is the Medic's mountain cap. I don't really have a good reason as to why it's his most forgotten, since yes, other hats that look like it are also in the game, and it's only really seen if unboxed as an unusual. This is like the one medic hat whose simplicity and charm I appreciate the most, since this hat neither adds too much nor takes away from the medic's overall appearance as a, well, medic. It strikes this middle ground of complementing your loadout since it won't really look out of place on your medic, but at the same time, it's such a realistic themed hat that it's not going to be the focal point of your loadout to begin with. Out of all the hats I've called simple so far, this would have to be at the #1 spot for simplicity, but that's not a bad thing since even though it's leaning more towards the forgettable side, it's still a nice hat overall and I appreciate it for being one of Medic's most realistic and grounded hats. I only chose one hat for Sniper because I feel like all of his hats have a healthy balance of being used in players' loadouts. I mean, Sniper has tons of great hats, so of course most of them are going to be used and seen. Despite all of his great hats though, there's one that I think is his most forgotten. It's the Wetworks. Even though I don't think it fits the Sniper's character as well as his other hat options, I love this cosmetic. Something about it just works. Or Wetworks? I honestly can't put my finger on it, but it just looks cool. I think that it's more forgotten these days simply because, again, the rest of Sniper's hat selection is mostly better in comparison. One interesting thing to note is that a Stormy Storm Wetworks is worth a lot of money. Probably because it's a themed unusual. You know, Sniper wearing a rain hat that constantly has a rain cloud above him? Funny stuff. I really wish more people would wear this hat because it's just great. If only it were one of Sniper's more memorable hats. Lastly, we've got Spy's most forgotten hat, which I'm giving to his Hat of Cards. It's one of those hats that again is basically the same as another pre-existing hat, but in this case it's nearly identical to the Spy's fancy fedora, which is also the first hat ever given to Spy. The belt and cards are a nice touch to the hat, but at the same time that's all the hat really has going for it. Interestingly enough, which I wasn't even aware of before making this video, the Hat of Cards is placed at a slight angle on the Spy's head in comparison to the fancy fedora. Also, it seems like an obvious design choice, but the red texture is using heart and diamond cards, and the blue texture is using club and spade cards is genius. Also, I've never noticed this during the 10,000 hours I've played TF2, but the Spy has team-colored cigarettes? Huh. In the end, the Hat of Cards is actually a pretty cool hat, but since the fancy fedora exists and is one of Spy's most popular cosmetics, the Hat of Cards is therefore Spy's most forgotten hat. There it is guys, the most forgotten hats in TF2. Again, these are just my picks, but I'm interested to see what you guys think are the most forgotten hats. Let me know in the comments what hats you guys would consider forgettable. Also let me know if you want to see another video like this in the future. I plan to make a similar video sometime, but instead focusing on what full body cosmetics are the most forgotten. But if you guys like me focusing on forgotten hats instead, I'd love to hear some feedback. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.